All right, everybody, welcome back into Cherry Picking. Today's episode, we're going to be looking at goalies to target and fade in the upcoming fantasy hockey season. I've got another great guest for today's show, Anna Dua, who's a host and reporter for the NHL, especially all things to do with fantasy hockey. So, Anna, how summer's obviously been great, I'm sure, but I'm sure you're excited to talk more hockey, and obviously the NHL season is coming back soon.
I'm so excited. We're in for a treat this year, guys, especially in fantasy because there's so much depth across this league. So I feel like this is going to be the most fun draft I've had in quite some time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm excited for this year. There's like definitely a lot of unknowns with some of these teams with a lot of what happened in the offseason. But as I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at some of the goalies, especially maybe the top 15 to 20 goalies, and I have some specific questions for some of them in interesting situations. But let's start with the top 5. So the rankings I was kind of looking at before the Hockey News dropped like their top 300, which is usually a pretty good list to go off of. And the top 5 right now that I'm seeing, and I kind of agree with, is Ilya Sorokin at 1, Andrei Vasilevskiy, Jake Oettinger, Connor Hellebuyck, and then Igor Shesterkin to kind of round out that list right there. So my question for you off the top is, do you have a consensus number 1 goalie that you're looking at for fantasy hockey? And out of those 5 goalies, is there any of them that don't deserve to be in the top 5 right now?
So we actually come up with our own list in the offseason.
Okay.
It's available right now on nhl.com/fantasy of our top 250 player rankings and rankings at every position. And ours are slightly different. We have Shesterkin at number 1, Sorokin, Vasilevskiy, Oettinger, and then Georgiev. So we don't have Connor Hellebuyck in the top 5, just straight off the bat. Personally, for me, there is some debate that goes into this because I'm not the only one choosing these rankings. I think that Ilya Sorokin is my consensus number 1 at this point. There's no more consistent goalie if you're looking at just individual performance in the entire NHL than Sorokin right now. 924 save percentage minimum in both of his last 2 seasons. Doesn't matter what team he plays behind, gets the starts, puts up great numbers night after night. So in my eyes, he's number 1. You could argue Shesterkin to be number 1, and then Vasilevskiy, I think, rounds out the top 3. But Hellebuyck is just kind of, I guess, a little bit impacted by the state of the Winnipeg Jets right now more than anything. He's a great workhorse starter. You're going to get the starts out of him regardless, but that's one goalie where you never really know how his team is going to pan out around him. And I think there's some better options. And this year there's so many options. So I'm looking at a guy on a more solid team like Georgiev instead.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I totally agree. I don't think Connor Hellebuyck should be in the top 5 right now. Just as you mentioned, it seems like the Jets are kind of in more of a start of a rebuild of what could be after, dealing Pierre-Luc Dubois and dealing with some troubles this offseason. And, we saw how Connor Hellebuyck played in the playoffs last year. Didn't really instill a lot of confidence into drafting him. And then, the addition of Laurent Brossoit as well, like he played really well in the playoffs when Adin Hill was out and even in the tail end of the regular season. So I think he'll probably compete with starts there. And then I agree. Igor Shesterkin is my number 1 goalie heading into this year. The addition of Peter Laviolette, I think, it will really help him. I think it'll help this team go in a different direction defensively and overall will in turn kind of help Igor there. So I love that you said that about Connor Hellebuyck, and I'm definitely kind of agree with your guys, I guess, list right now with Igor being at number 1. But there are definitely 3 goalies that I think that are interesting situations at this point. Ilya Samsonov with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I'd love to get your thoughts on him right now because obviously it's a crowded goalie room with Martin. They've added Martin Jones and then also Joseph Woll as well. I don't think a lot of people know this, but when Joseph Woll and Jake Oettinger were both playing in the U.S. national development team together, Joseph Woll was actually starting over him. So I think Oettinger's gotten more of an opportunity with the Stars. And for whatever reason, Joseph Woll hasn't gotten the same thing in Toronto. But what are you kind of expecting from Samsonov going into this year?
I worry about him just a little bit because I think the Toronto Maple Leafs have gotten better. I think right now they're the strongest team in the Atlantic with what happened with the Boston Bruins this offseason, and that's going to benefit Samsonov. But I've also seen how he played behind a very strong team in Washington early on in his career as well. And he was a pretty inconsistent goalie there in the tandem they had behind a team that was very, very good at the time coming off of their Stanley Cup championship victory. And so I worry about him because I really need to see like like a full season of his full potential before he's someone I'm reaching for in drafts. I think, like I've said, and I'm going to say a million times, there's just so many options this season that he's not a goalie that sticks out to me. Is he a top 20 goalie in fantasy? Of course, because of the team he plays behind, but is he a goalie I'm necessarily targeting? Given his history, not yet. But Joseph Woll, on the other hand, is a goalie that I'm definitely looking at in like keeper dynasty leagues at the very least, right? He impressed me with what I've seen from him so far. If he gets the opportunity, he might run with it. Maybe that would be like a draft steal in that type of situation, but in a normal fantasy league, Toronto, I'm a little bit wary of in terms of netminders.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And then looking at a few other guys here in interesting situations, Tristan Jarry as well. Obviously, Casey DeSmith's gone, but he had a fine year last year. Not really anything to write home about. I think he finished with like 47 starts, so obviously not the huge volume that we see with guys like 60 starts and 65 starts. But this team, what I'm kind of worried about with Pittsburgh is their defensive unit is like so offensive. You know, bringing in Erik Karlsson, you still have Chris Letang, a couple other young guys that really haven't maybe figured out the defensive side or the defensive structure of this Pittsburgh team. And Kyle Dubas has never, like when Kyle Dubas was in Toronto, there weren't really like great goalie seasons there, especially when you're looking in terms of fantasy. So how do you feel Tristan Jarry kind of fits in with this group this year?
So he makes our top 25, but he's towards the bottom of that list just because all of the concerns you mentioned, I completely agree with. Pittsburgh, I think, did improve from what they were last season by adding Erik Karlsson, but it doesn't address the concerns I have in terms of drafting a fantasy goalie from the Penguins because their offense is boosted. I don't necessarily know how that's going to translate to Tristan Jarry, and he's a goalie that's been given the chance to prove himself and is still rather inconsistent behind a decently solid team at the very least, and there's just a lot of good options out there this year. I might take a secondary guy in a tandem over Tristan Jarry, even though he's the go-to guy in Pittsburgh right now, because there's a lot of great goalies in the league. Part of these tandem systems, we've kind of like shifted away from like a go-to starter right now. And a lot of teams have like two goalies that they're comfortable rotating. So it gives fantasy owners an option to like have 2-3 goalies on their roster and get some really good value out of them. And I don't know if Tristan Jarry's like speaking out to me as one of those goalies that I got to draft this year.
Yeah, and then the last guy we'll kind of touch on out of these three goalies is Linus Ullmark, because in a lot of the rankings I've seen, you know, a little bit further down, after winning the Vezina last year, you know, you'd think he might be a little bit higher on some people's lists, but, you know, obviously a goalie like him is kind of bursting onto the scene at this point, you know, struggled a little bit when he was in Buffalo. So where do you guys have him on your list right now? And are you expecting a similar season to last year? I know you mentioned that obviously Boston took a hit with their depth chart and roster, Patrice Bergeron being gone, David Krejci being gone as well. So what do you think about Linus Ullmark and kind of how his fantasy hockey production will be this season?
So he's 6th for us right now, and he's not too far above Jeremy Swayman. So he's not in our top 5, but barely outside of the top 5 because he had a great season last year. You can't really deny that. Georgiev was tied with him for the most wins in the NHL, and he's on a better team in the Colorado Avalanche, which is why he edged him out to round out the top 5 for us. But Ullmark's right behind him. I think Boston is going to take a hit based off of the retirements they had. They lost Bertuzzi. They're losing some key pieces. They have the superstar power of Pasternak and those guys, but I think they're not going to completely fall off the wagon in terms of the games are going to be closer. They're going to lose some wins. I don't think it's going to be a lopsided defeat for Boston. So whoever's playing goal is going to still be behind a solid team in the Boston Bruins. I wonder how this season's going to pan out with him and Jeremy Swayman, though, because I could easily see a guy like Jeremy Swayman going on a hot streak and maybe taking some of those starts away from Ullmark because they were part of a tandem last year. Swayman has a lot of upside. He's a younger guy. And maybe if he takes over the reins, all of a sudden you wished you would have drafted Jeremy Swayman instead. So just given their situation, that's the only reason I'm a bit cautious. But I think he deserves to be 6th at least. On our list, he's 6th. I think that's a very, very fair ranking spot for Ullmark this season.
Yeah, I agree. The Hockey News fantasy or ranking list, they have him at 10th out of their goalies. So I thought that was a little disrespectful, I say, to the guy who just won the Vezina Trophy. I obviously understand with what happened with Boston and then Jeremy Swayman being in the picture for sure. And then you look at one guy this year I think is really interesting because I think a lot of people don't really know what to expect with this Vancouver Canucks team. And last year, Thatcher Demko, you know, he was hurt for a good part of the year. And even when he was on the ice, he was struggling. You know, he only played 32 games and he finished as I think like just outside of the 30 in terms of fantasy hockey rankings on Yahoo. So it's interesting to see kind of where he'll fit in this year. considering everything going on in Vancouver. So is Demko a guy you're targeting maybe in the later rounds, or are you just completely staying away from Thatcher Demko this season?
He's someone that intrigues me, not someone I'm looking forward to dropping because I want to scoop him up that badly. But if we look 2 seasons ago, he had 33 wins. So that's really impressive. Last year, you mentioned he was injured, didn't even play 33 games. But when I look at Demko, his floor is higher than a lot of other goalies. The guy's never had a season where he's posted a save percentage in the 800s in which he's played even 2 games. So at the very least, his fantasy floor is decently high, but Vancouver is in a tough division. The entire league is just becoming better, and I don't really know the direction in which the Canucks are heading right now. So it's tough for me to like feel confident in drafting Thatcher Demko given the team he's playing behind. But individually, he's not the worst goalie to pick up in later rounds of drafts because of how high his floor is, even though his ceiling is not that high this season.
Okay. Yeah. He's definitely going to be one of the more interesting draft choices. I think there'll be so many, like a big wide range of where he'll get taken in drafts. And then another guy who obviously had an incredible playoffs, one of the better playoffs, I guess, runs in the last 5 years, along with on all these Andrei Vasilevsky playoff runs we saw. But Sergei Bobrovsky was fantastic. But in the regular season, he was super streaky. We saw him have months where he was fantastic and then other months where he was kind of just struggling. Where do you expect, or where do you guys have him on your I guess, list right now? And then what do you expect from him this year? Because one thing that stood out to me when I was looking at some of the stats, preparing for this show and just this upcoming season, he was giving up a lot of rebounds. His rebounds per save were right around the same mark as Grubauer and Sam Montembeault, 2 guys that didn't have great seasons on okay teams. So what do you think about Sergei Bobrovsky's fantasy production wise this season?
So we have him ranked at 12th. So he's a top 15 goalie on our list, which I think is really fair, not too high, not too low. Mm-hmm. He did impress me in the postseason. His performance was probably one of the biggest reasons the Panthers made it as far as they did. So you got to give him credit. And you also have to remember he showed flashes of the way he used to be back in Columbus. This guy's a Vezina winning goalie. He had amazing seasons with the Columbus Blue Jackets not too long ago. It feels like ages ago now based off of what we've seen from him in Florida, but he has the potential to be a solid goalie. My concern with Bobrovsky is obviously he's not been doing well in the regular season as of late, even though his postseason performance was amazing and definitely even Conn Smythe winning if Florida had pulled it off. On the other hand, though, Florida as a team, you got to remember, barely made it into the postseason last year, like clawed their way in there. The Atlantic is becoming more difficult. That's one of the biggest storylines in the entire league heading into this season. A lot of teams like Buffalo and Ottawa are coming up, and they're going to take wins away from other teams in their division. And how does Florida really stack up? Do they have the ability after barely making it in last season and having all of those concerns during the regular season to be dominant? Because we're kind of like looking at this team through like rose-colored glasses, because yes, they made it to the Stanley Cup final, but they had a lot of great momentum from that first round against Boston that they were able to harness and carry it through all throughout the postseason. In the regular season, you still got to play all 82 games. And we saw the concerns that I had with Florida last year. I have similar concerns this year, and now they're going to have a tougher schedule. So that's where I worry about Bobrovsky, but I think top 15 is really, really fair for him.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you really brought up a good point there in terms of how tough this Eastern Conference is. Like it's a juggernaut to get wins, especially. That's probably the most important part when you're looking at your fantasy hockey goalies. So before we close the show, I definitely need to know, who's your biggest sleeper when it comes to fantasy hockey goalies for the upcoming season?
So I have like 3 goalies, like semi-3 goalies. We'll get into that I'm kind of monitoring this year. Number 1 is Devin Levi. Okay, so this kid is 21, talking about the Atlantic Division, Buffalo Sabres. He did well in his debut. I mean, he's new to the league. He really impressed people to start with, but I like this kid a lot, and he's playing behind a Sabres team that is a really solid team. I think this is the year they make it into the postseason. They have a lot of talented young players that have taken the next step, and he's going to be their guy in the crease. And I'm really excited about him. So I might even take a guy like Devin Levi over a guy like Sergei Bobrovsky this year, just to take a flyer on him and see how he goes. In keeper and dynasty leagues, it's a no-brainer. You absolutely have to draft this kid. His ceiling is so high, and he's so young, and so are the entire Buffalo Sabres. So you know he's going to be good for some time to come. He's a guy I'm watching. Akira Schmid in New Jersey. I think could be like a huge draft steal in terms of a goalie this year. 922 save percentage in the regular season with the Devils. The only reason they even made it as far as they did in the postseason, he really saved that team. 921 save percentage in the playoffs because Vanacek just kind of fumbled the ball there. And what if that happens again in the regular season? Schmid's the younger goalie. He's shown upside. What if he takes the reins over on this New Jersey Devils team that has so much hype around them? Everyone's excited to watch the Devils this season. They're one of the strongest teams in the NHL, and everyone's excited to see how well they're going to pan out after the year they had last year. Now, what if Schmid harnesses all of that benefactors to himself rather than it going to Vanacek as people expect? And I think that's really likely to happen. That wouldn't shock me at all if at some point in the year we see him become their go-to guy. And lastly, I got to give a shout out to like the three-headed monster that's happening in Carolina. A lot of people are nervous because you can't really like guess how many starts any of these goalies are going to get since they brought all three of them back, which did surprise me, but maybe you get them at a better position in your fantasy drafts. And I don't think you could go wrong with having Anderson on your roster or Kochetkov, especially in keeper and dynasty leagues for that one, or Antti Ranta, because when you're looking at goalies, you're looking at the team they're playing behind. Carolina allowed the fewest shots on goal out of any team in the NHL per game last season. That's a really, really solid team. In my head, they're a front runner right now for the President's Trophy. And so why wouldn't you want to harness one of those goalies, especially because a lot of people are going to stay away from them since they got three in their goalie room right now.
Yeah, those are three great picks. Definitely three younger options as well for people in dynasty and keeper leagues for their upcoming years. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. Devin Levi Northeastern was fantastic. And then looking at Pyotr Kochetkov as well, he was awesome when he given the time, but obviously again a very crowded goalie room at this point. So you kind of have to wait to see how that unfolds. But three great sleeper picks nonetheless. Anna, I appreciate you coming on the show today. It was awesome. Good luck with all your preseason hockey fantasy rankings. Hopefully there's not too many trolls out there kind of coming for you before the hockey season starts.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you guys thought of our target and cage goalies. Let me know what you thought of Anna's sleepers for the upcoming season, and we'll see you in the next episode.